Hello, and welcome to our conversation about the consecrated life. Pope Francis, in his recent letter to the Church, specifically pointed out 3 items that he wanted to share with the consecrated religious of the world. In his recent letter, he says, "The first of these aims is to look to the past with gratitude. All our institutes are heir to a history rich in charisms. At their origin, we see the hand of God, who in his Spirit calls certain individuals to follow Christ more closely, to translate the gospel into a particular way of life, to read the signs of the times with the eyes of faith, and to respond creatively to the needs of the church. This initial experience then matured and developed, engaging new members in new geographic and cultural contexts, and giving rise to new ways of exercising the charism, new initiatives and expressions of apostolic charity. Like the seed which becomes a tree, each institute grew and stretched out its branches. During this year, it would be appropriate for each charismatic family to reflect on its origins and history, in order to thank God who grants the Church a variety of gifts which embellish her and equip her for every good work." To reach that aim this evening, we are talking with Father Lawrence Jagdfeld and sharing some of the history of Sacred Heart Province and how we've reached out to the world.
Thank you, Donald. In his letter, Pope Francis states that in order to preserve our identity, we have to look to the past. And if we look to the past of Sacred Heart Province, the one thing that comes to my mind anyway is my perspective, and it is just my perspective. Each of the friars, both now and in the past, would have had their own perspective of what our identity is. And I think that that's a good thing, that we each have a good way of looking at the province. But when I think of the identity of our province, I remember a story from one of my classmates who was visiting the Curia in Rome. And as he was walking through the corridors of the Curia, a friar came up to him and said, "So what province are you from?" And his response was, "I'm from Sacred Heart Province in the United States of America." And immediately that friar said, one of the great missionary provinces of the order. And as I look at our history, that's what comes to my mind, that we are and have always been a missionary province, both in the present as well as in the past, and perhaps even in the future. In 1858, when the friars came here to Illinois, they came as missioners. We had been asked by the Bishop of Alton to come and to take care of the German-speaking immigrants in his diocese. And between 1858 and 1879, the friars founded 4 friaries, and each of those friaries helped or ministered to German-speaking immigrants. Now, there were other satellite communities that they ministered to. There's even a record of them ministering to a French-speaking community in central Illinois. But by and large, we ministered to the German-speaking immigrants of this central Illinois.
What were the principal activities of the friars at that time?
Well, in each of those 4 friaries, in Quincy and Teutopolis, Illinois, in St. Louis, Missouri, and in Memphis, Tennessee, there was a parish, and we were ministering to the German-speaking people of that parish. But in addition to those parishes, the friars also tried to establish, based upon the German model of the gymnasium, they tried to establish educational institutions to provide for the education of German-speaking young men who wanted a Catholic education, something they couldn't get in Germany. And so the friars founded these educational institutions, one in Teutopolis and one in Quincy. And eventually there would even form another one in Cleveland, Ohio, although it didn't last very long. In addition to those educational ministries, the friars also did an awful lot of preaching. They gave parish missions and made itinerant journeys in which they took care of many of the communities in southern Illinois. As we read that history, we hear about how they would go by horseback, they would go by wagon, and even to a certain extent by riverboat, as well as walking throughout central and southern Illinois. So in 1875, there was a tremendous influx of friars because of the Kulturkampf in Germany at the hands of Kaiser Bismarck. There were so many friars that Morris Klosterman, who was the commissary of the entity at that time, founded several new friaries to provide housing for these almost 100 new friars that came to this country. And then the province then extended from Cleveland, Ohio, all the way to St. Bernard, Nebraska, and as far north as Bayfield, Wisconsin, just to provide for those friars.
Our missionary efforts to the people of other nations began soon after, didn't it?
In 1879, when the province was founded, just simply 1 year later, in 1880, the very first friar went to China to minister to the people of China, and he worked with the German-speaking friars from Germany. He worked in their mission. He assisted in their mission. And from 1880 to 1922, the friars worked in those missions. And there were several friars who went to China. There were the Get brothers, one of whom became a bishop, and there was a Middendorf. There were several friars who went to work in China. But then in 1922, the friars accepted the mission of the Shantung province in China, and they ministered in that province then from 1922 until the communist takeover in China during World War II.
What about here in the United States? Did the friars go beyond the German-speaking immigrants?
Very much so. I can say very strong yes to that question. Actually, the year before the friars became a province, before Sacred Heart Province was erected, in 1878, 2 friars were sent to Bayfield, Wisconsin, Casimir Vogt and John Gaffron. They took responsibility for the Chippewa Indian reservations in northern Wisconsin. Then, shortly after that, we were also asked to accept responsibility for the Menominee Indian reservations. And these friars really worked very, very hard. It was interesting the way they did it. They split their time up. One would stay in Bayfield, working among the people of Bayfield, and the other one would then make a circuit to all of the various communities on the reservation. It would take about 6 months for him to get all the way around and through all kinds of weather. And there weren't any roads in northern Wisconsin at that time, so they basically had to walk or go by horseback. But the interesting thing is that the forest was so dense that sometimes even the horse couldn't get through. During the winter, the friars learned to use snowshoes at the instruction of the Indians so that they could move around. So then when that friar got back to Bayfield after his 6-month trek, the other one would start out right after him. So they just alternated back and forth, doing that very, very long circuit, ministering to hundreds of Native American communities.
Were the friars also involved in the Southwest with the Native Americans?
Yes. Shortly after the Minister General asked us to take over the Mission Santa Barbara, which was left over from when the friars were in California with Junipero Serra. The friars ministered to the Indian reservations of the Pima and the Papago Indians in Arizona. Now you have to remember that Junipero Serra was basically there to take care of the Native American population, that he was founding those missions for the sake of bringing education and also the Christian way of life to those Indians in California. But those missions had fallen on hard times because of the suppression of the church in Mexico. And there were only 3 friars left in California, and that's why the general minister asked us to go and accept the responsibility for those missions. But then they branched out. They went to Arizona. They also made a slight incursion into New Mexico, and they ministered to Native Americans in those states as well.
Lawrence, when did the friars first begin working in Brazil?
During World War II, it became impossible for the German missionaries that had founded missions in Brazil to get to those missions. And so the general minister again asked the friars of the Sacred Heart Province if we would assist those German-speaking friars. And so in 1943, 4 friars of Sacred Heart Province struck out for the Amazon River Valley. And the friars have been present in that area, Santarém, Brazil, and the neighboring area. They have been present there since 1943. And even today, there are still some American friars from Sacred Heart Province who are present in those missions, although they are now the elders of that custody or vice province that ministers to the people of the Amazon.
What other kinds of activities were the friars involved in?
Since the later part of the 20th century, there have been several different efforts on the part of the order to establish the order in various countries. So for instance, the Africa Project. But before the Africa Project, there was an effort on the part of Sacred Heart Province to again assist other friars, in this case I believe it was the Belgian friars, to work in their mission in Zaire. Unfortunately, that was a very short-lived experiment because of the fact that there was a civil war going on and the friars ended up being expelled from that mission. And then later, somewhat later after that, the order tried to resend people into China when China opened its doors to the possibility of Americans being in China. And so 2 friars went from the province to work in China. Today we still have people in Africa, we still have people in Asia, Southeast Asia, in Thailand and in Vietnam, and our presence is still very, very much viable in those parts of the world. Between Brazil and China, over 10% of the manpower of the province was present in missionary activity to other nations. It was interesting that Pius XII actually made that kind of request. He wanted the religious of the United States to send 10% of their manpower to the mission ad gentes. And when the apostolic visitator came to talk to the friars of Sacred Heart Province, he was rather surprised to find out that we already had over 10% in those missionary activities.
If that 10% of the friars were involved in the missions, how did that become so much a part of our identity?
Well, as I said in the beginning, it really was the way we started. But in addition to that, many of the friars who stayed here in the United States were very much involved in the missionary effort through various activities. For instance, one of the big moments in our history was the establishment of the Franciscan Press, the Franciscan Herald Press. And the magazine, the Franciscan Herald, was actually begun to raise funds for the missions in China. The whole purpose of that magazine was just simply to provide for the economic growth of the Chinese missionaries. But in addition to that, our various parishes had mission clubs. And those mission clubs did all kinds of things to support our missionaries in China and in Brazil. One of the biggest ones of those clubs that I can remember, and you might remember as well, was at St. Augustine's in Chicago, where the mothers of our missionaries put together this club to support their sons in this missionary effort. Another big club was at Our Lady of the Angels in Cleveland, where the mothers of the missionaries from Cleveland also began a huge club in the parish there to support our missions. But in addition to that, in the 1920s, 1930s, the bishops of this country began to ask the friars to consider working in the mission areas of the United States. I'm sure you've heard of the Extension Society in the United States, which provided for those areas of the country that didn't have any priests, didn't even have any churches. I can remember even as late as the 1970s, 1980s, there were counties in Tennessee, for instance, that didn't have any priest. And so the friars were asked by those bishops to consider working in those areas. And it was in response to those requests that the friars went to places like northern Louisiana to work among the African American population. And it was also in response to the Bishop of San Antonio that we went to Texas to work among the Latino population of Texas. So the missionary effort of our province was not restricted to what we would call foreign missions, or what is technically called mission ad gentes, to the nations, but also even within our own boundaries, even within the United States, the friars were very much mission-oriented. It was in the context of us working with the African American peoples of northern Louisiana and also in Tennessee that we came into contact with a future saint in the United States, Sister Catherine, or Mother Catherine Drexel, who founded the school of our parish in Nashville at St. Vincent de Paul. Much later in our history, in the 1980s, there was another effort to reach out to Native Americans in the state of Alaska, among the Athabascan Indians, in the far northern reaches of that state. Interestingly enough, that territory is bigger than any other territory in which the friars live and work, and there has never been more than 4 friars up there, and even with the friars, there never been more than a dozen or maybe 16 priests in that whole area, in an area that's bigger than the country of France. So even though it is not a foreign mission, it is much of a much developed missionary activity.
There's still something about flexed mission. What's that about?
Yes. Now, in the early 21st century, right after the millennium, the friars gathered in chapter, and we realized that we're getting older. We're getting to the point where we simply don't have the numbers or the young people who can staff foreign missions or missions ad gentes. So in response to the needs of several of the Franciscan entities throughout the world, we decided that we would make it possible for friars to spend short periods of time lending them help with formation, lending them help with language development. Their need in those areas, we would oftentimes joke, was that they needed a little gray hair, which we could supply, because those entities are very much younger than we are in terms of their population and in terms of their existence. As a matter of fact, I'm sure you can even reflect on that a little bit, since you participated in one of those activities that we call Flex Mission.
Yes, that's true. I just returned from working for 3 years in Vietnam. The friars there have a very young community. They have over 150 students, young men, in formation at this time. So they have been asking our province to work with their students to help them with their English language skills. It's been kind of interesting to see so much energy and youth and vitality. Also the chance to be those gray-haired men, or no-haired men, with the friars, to be a presence in their communities. I was the youngest friar here in my community. Going there, I was the oldest. The province there has been going for about over 75 years, but it's been the last 10 years or so that they've invited us to be able to help them in their ministries, mainly in the educational facility, their seminary just outside of Ho Chi Minh City. It was a very exciting time, a very great experience to be able to share and to give the students that chance to learn English, because English is going to be the main language in the Southeast Asia. It's the common language among all those people. Right now, they're sending their friars out to Korea, Thailand, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia. And English is the one language that they can all use together, especially in community living. So it's neat to be a part of their missionary experience as they begin taking on the role of the new generation of missionaries.
So to summarize the whole thing, while there are all kinds of activities that went on during our 150-year history, and activities of which the friars can be justly proud, for me, the real identity of the province has always been in our willingness to look for new opportunities to spread the gospel, to be missionaries in that respect. And not only to be proud of those moments, but also to be grateful for them. One of the things that I think the Holy Father stresses in his letter on consecrated life is that not only do we remember our past simply to preserve our identity, but also as a source of gratitude for all that God has been and done in our lives. One can point to our educational institutions in this province. One can point to the 3 retreat houses that we once staffed in this province. One can point to the fact that in the 1960s we were serving in over 100 parishes in the Midwest. Those are all things for which we can be proud and which can, in fact, inform our perspective of who we are, what our identity is. And as I said at the outset, the fact that I find the identity in this notion of mission or missionaries is not the only way to look at Sacred Heart Province. And it certainly is not the only thing for which we are grateful. I think that as we explore this letter that the Holy Father has given us, that we can look at it from many different perspectives.
Thank you for sharing about our history and the gratitude that we feel as Sacred Heart Province. Now we turn to you, our viewers. You should have received a list of questions that you could discuss in groups today. We want you to take a moment to share what is your idea of the Sacred Heart identity. What do you bring from that gives you gratitude and gives you fulfillment in your life? We'll pause now to give you that time and that space to share with your brothers. Thank you for listening, and God bless.